What if the earliest signs of Sjogren's had little to do with dry eyes or a dry mouth? What if it started with subtle, strange changes in personality? So odd that even doctors often miss them. New research shows these behavioral shifts can appear years before diagnosis, quietly signaling that the immune system is already attacking the body from the inside. And the longer they are ignored, the more damage becomes irreversible. In this video, you will discover 9 of the weirdest and most unsettling personality changes that can predict Sjogren's long before the classic symptoms ever appear. Recognizing them early could give you a vital head start before it is too late to act. Before we go any further, if you or someone you love is dealing with symptoms that keep shifting, that never quite fit one diagnosis, and that doctors keep dismissing, I've put together a symptom map that shows exactly how this condition progresses, what shows up at each stage, and where the standard tests are most likely to miss it. Type symptom map in the comments right now and I'll send it to you directly. Because what I'm about to show you next is why that map matters more than most people realize, and why the stage you're in changes everything about what happens next. Number 1. Sudden emotional detachment that feels nothing like depression. Before her diagnosis, Patricia had been the kind of person who remembered every birthday in her extended family, called friends just to check in, and cried at television commercials. She was 56, warm, expressive, and socially engaged in a way that was simply part of who she was. Then something changed. It was not dramatic at first. She began canceling plans without real explanation. She stopped responding to messages the way she used to. She sat through family dinners without saying much, and when her husband asked what was wrong she told him she felt nothing. Not sadness exactly. Not grief. Just a flatness, like someone had turned down the volume on everything that used to matter. Her doctor ordered thyroid panels. He screened for depression. Everything came back without a clear answer. What no one considered for another 2 years was Sjogren's. Here is what research has confirmed about this. Sjogren's is not confined to the tear glands and salivary glands. It is a systemic autoimmune disease with documented involvement of the central nervous system, and one of the earliest neurological effects is a measurable flattening of emotional response that resembles depression on the surface, but does not respond the way depression does. Studies examining psychiatric manifestations in primary Sjogren's syndrome have found that emotional blunting, reduced motivation, and the inability to feel normal levels of pleasure are reported in a significant proportion of patients and often appear before the dryness symptoms that typically lead to diagnosis. The mechanism behind this is not psychological. The chronic immune activation of Sjogren's releases inflammatory molecules that are capable of crossing into the brain, where they suppress the circuits responsible for emotional engagement, social motivation, and reward. The result is a person who looks withdrawn and flat to the people around them, but is not depressed in the classical sense. They are experiencing a neurological consequence of an immune disease that nobody has identified yet. The emotional world has not collapsed. It has been muted by inflammation. If this sounds like something you have been through or watched someone you love go through, type the word flat in the comments right now. You are not alone in this, and your comment will help someone else feel seen who is watching this same video trying to make sense of the same experience. Number 2. An abrupt and new intolerance of noise, crowds, and social situations that were previously comfortable. Janet had taught in a busy high school for more than 2 decades. She had never been someone who was bothered by noise. She thrived in full rooms and had always been the last to leave any staff gathering. Then in the space of about 18 months, something shifted. She started flinching at background noise in restaurants. She began leaving family events early, citing headaches that felt like pressure building from the inside. Ordinary conversation in a group started feeling like too much input arriving all at once. She told her family she needed quiet but could not explain why. Tests of her ears showed nothing structural. A specialist cleared her neurologically. No one ordered the autoimmune panel that might have connected the dots for another 3 years, by which point her Sjogren's had progressed to include measurable nerve involvement. What is actually happening when this occurs is called central sensitization, and it is a well-documented feature of Sjogren's with neurological involvement. When Sjogren's attacks peripheral nerve fibers, which it is known to do through immune-mediated inflammation, the nervous system's processing of sensory input becomes dysregulated. The brain begins interpreting normal levels of sound, light, and social stimulation as threatening or overwhelming, not because of anxiety but because the sensory gating mechanisms that normally filter input have been disrupted by immune activity. Research published in peer-reviewed neurology journals has confirmed that hypersensitivity to sensory input is a documented early feature of Sjogren's neurological involvement, and that it is consistently misread in clinical settings as panic disorder, generalized anxiety, or sensory processing issues when the actual driver is autoimmune. A person who was comfortable in loud, busy, stimulating environments for their entire adult life and then suddenly is not, without any clear triggering event, is not developing a new anxiety disorder. They may be experiencing the nervous system effects of an undiagnosed autoimmune disease. If this pattern is familiar to you or to someone you know, type the word noise in the comments below. You might be the reason someone else finally gets the right answer. Number 3. Waves of mental confusion and cognitive fog that come and go without warning. Marcus was 61 and had spent his career managing complex engineering projects without difficulty. His mind had always been one of his strongest assets. Then something started happening that he struggled to describe. On some days everything was fine. Sharp, clear, functional. On other days he would lose the thread of a sentence he was still forming. He would search for a common word and it simply would not come. He would walk into a room and stand there with no memory of what had brought him there. His wife started calling it the on and off switch because that was exactly what it felt like. When it finally came up during an appointment for unrelated joint pain and the full autoimmune workup was done, the Sjogren's diagnosis answered every one of those questions in a single result. Research published in scientific reports and confirmed by multiple subsequent studies found that cognitive difficulties are among the most commonly reported and most disabling features of primary Sjogren syndrome. Memory lapses, word retrieval difficulties, difficulty concentrating, and reduced processing speed are reported by the majority of Sjogren's patients with neurological involvement. What makes the pattern in Sjogren's distinct from age-related cognitive decline or early dementia is its intermittent and fluctuating nature. The brain is not degenerating in a progressive linear way. It is being periodically disrupted by inflammatory activity that waxes and wanes with immune flares. On a low inflammation day the person is themselves. On a high inflammation day the circuits slow down, stall, or misfire. This is why these episodes are so consistently dismissed as stress, perimenopause, sleep deprivation, or anxiety. Because on the day the person sees their doctor, they may be perfectly lucid. The fog has lifted and there is nothing obvious to observe. But the pattern, the recurring episodic confusion in a person who was previously cognitively sharp, is the signal, and it deserves investigation, not dismissal. If you have experienced this kind of fog, the kind that comes and goes and leaves you questioning your own mind, type the word fog in the comments below. You are describing a real physiological event, not a personal failing. Number 4. Irritability that feels physical before it ever becomes emotional. Sandra's husband had a specific way of describing what happened to her. He said she was not angry about anything in particular. She was just angry. She had been patient and steady throughout their marriage, and then somewhere in her early 50s she started snapping at small things. A slow driver. A slightly disorganized pantry. An email that took too long to get a reply. But the part that confused even Sandra herself was that she felt the irritability as a physical sensation first. A pressure behind her eyes and across her forehead before it ever became an outward reaction. She told her doctor it felt biological. It did not feel like stress or frustration. It felt like something happening in her body that was then shaping her mood. Her doctor prescribed a low-dose anxiety medication. She took it for over a year before a rheumatologist finally identified elevated inflammatory markers and ran the antibody tests that confirmed Sjogren's syndrome. The connection between Sjogren's and irritability is physiological, not psychiatric. Research examining inflammatory cytokines in primary Sjogren's syndrome has found elevated levels of interleukin-6 and other pro-inflammatory signaling molecules in active disease. These cytokines are not confined to the glands. They circulate systemically and are known to act on the limbic system, the region of the brain responsible for emotional regulation and threat response, in ways that directly increase emotional reactivity and lower the threshold for frustration and irritability. This is sometimes referred to as cytokine-induced mood dysregulation, and it is a physiological process with a measurable biological basis. It is not a character flaw. It is not stress overwhelming a weak coping system. When a person who has been emotionally regulated their whole adult life begins experiencing a persistent physical pressure that precedes their irritability, they are describing a neuroinflammatory mechanism with remarkable accuracy. They are feeling the cytokine signature of immune activation in real time. The tragedy is that almost no one in the standard clinical pathway is looking for that connection. If this physical before emotional irritability pattern sounds familiar, type the word pressure in the comments. Your description of this symptom may be exactly what another reader needs to recognize what they have been experiencing. Number 5. An obsession with tracking symptoms and health anxiety that appears suddenly in someone who never worried before. Diane was a logical, analytically oriented person who had worked in engineering for most of her career. She had never been anxious about her health. Annual checkups, no complaints, no particular concern about her body. Then over about 14 months she became someone she did not recognize. She started researching her symptoms obsessively. She kept a detailed notebook of every sensation, every unexplained ache, every episode of fatigue or brain fog. She visited urgent care 4 times in a single year for symptoms that did not resolve with any of the standard explanations she was given. Her doctor told her she was experiencing health anxiety disorder and referred her to therapy. She went. It did not help because the symptoms were real. 2 years later, after she brought the notebook to a different appointment and laid out the full pattern in sequence, the Sjogren's diagnosis arrived and everything in that notebook finally made sense. This pattern is one of the most consistently mishandled features of early autoimmune disease. When a person is generating real symptoms, unexplained fatigue, nerve sensations, joint discomfort, dry mucous membranes, intermittent cognitive changes, that do not yet have a name, the mind's rational response is to monitor carefully and search for an explanation. That is not anxiety disorder. That is a person accurately detecting that something is wrong with their body and trying to communicate it to a medical system that has not yet identified the cause. Research published in peer-reviewed rheumatology and autoimmunity journals has documented that patients with systemic autoimmune disease, including Sjogren's, frequently receive psychiatric diagnoses in the years preceding their correct diagnosis, specifically because the symptom picture is real but not yet attributable to a known condition. The psychiatric label does not make the symptoms go away. It delays the workup that would have identified them. The person is not imagining their illness. They are detecting it accurately. The system is failing to interpret what they are reporting. If you went through years of being told your symptoms were anxiety before getting a real answer, type the word real in the comments below. Because they were real. They always were. Number 6. Profound and personality-altering fatigue that changes who a person is over time. Robert had never been someone who complained about tiredness. He had run demanding projects throughout a long career, and never once identified fatigue as a limiting factor in his life. Then somewhere in his early 60s, the tiredness that arrived was different from anything he had experienced before. It was not the tiredness that sleep fixed. It was a depletion that went all the way down, something he described as existential rather than physical. He stopped initiating plans with people he had always made time for. He became shorter in his responses at work. His wife described it as watching someone slowly dim. He assumed burnout. Multiple sleep studies and a trial of antidepressants later, the diagnosis was primary Sjogren syndrome, and the fatigue was one of its central features. Research from the European League Against Rheumatism and multiple independent studies has established that fatigue is among the most prevalent and most debilitating features of primary Sjogren syndrome, affecting the majority of patients and frequently rated as the single most limiting symptom, ranked above dryness, pain, or joint involvement. What distinguishes Sjogren's fatigue from ordinary tiredness is its origin. The persistent immune activation characteristic of the disease generates a continuous fatigue signal through the inflammatory molecules it produces. This creates what is sometimes described as sickness behavior, the physical and emotional withdrawal, reduced motivation, social retreat, and cognitive slowing that occurs when the immune system is under sustained activation. The body is behaving as if it is fighting a continuous infection because, in an immune sense, it is. And just as a person with a serious flu withdraws, loses appetite for social engagement, and becomes irritable and flat, a person with active Sjogren's does the same thing but over months and years, without the visible markers that would make the people around them understand what is happening. The personality changes that come from this level of sustained fatigue are not weakness. They are the behavioral signature of an immune system in chronic overdrive. If Sjogren's fatigue or unexplained life-altering tiredness has changed who you are or who someone you love used to be, type the word drained in the comments. This kind of fatigue has a name and it has a cause, and you deserve care that reflects that. Number 7. A shift in temperature perception with no obvious physical explanation. Ellen had always run warm. For years she had been the one cracking the window open at night while her husband pulled another blanket onto the bed. Then in her late 50s her relationship with temperature changed entirely. She began feeling cold in a way that had never happened before, a cold that felt as though it was coming from somewhere inside her rather than from the air around her. She started wearing layers in warm weather. She filled a hot water bottle at night even in summer. At the same time she began noticing burning sensations in her hands and feet that had nothing to do with temperature and seemed to arrive without any clear trigger. When the Sjogren's diagnosis came, and with it the finding of small fiber neuropathy, both the internal cold and the burning sensations were explained by the same underlying mechanism. Small fiber neuropathy is a well-documented complication of Sjogren syndrome, occurring in a significant proportion of patients, particularly those with neurological involvement. The small nerve fibers that Sjogren's targets through its immune-mediated inflammatory process are the very fibers responsible for temperature sensation, pain signaling, and aspects of autonomic regulation. When these fibers are damaged, the signals they send to the brain become inaccurate or contradictory. A person may feel persistently cold because their temperature-sensing fibers are misfiring, and simultaneously experience burning or stinging sensations in their extremities because the damaged pain-signaling fibers are generating false positive signals. Research on Sjogren's associated small fiber neuropathy has documented that neuropathic pain, including burning sensations, numbness, tingling, and altered temperature perception, are among the most commonly reported and most distressing symptoms of this complication. The behavioral changes that come from this, wearing inappropriate amounts of clothing, avoiding air conditioning, becoming less mobile due to discomfort, avoiding social situations where temperature cannot be controlled, can look from the outside like odd quirks or personality shifts. They are neurological symptoms. If you or someone you know has experienced this kind of unexplained shift in temperature sensitivity or a strange burning sensation in the hands and feet, type the word burning in the comments. Naming it is the first step toward getting it properly investigated. Number 8. Loss of personal initiative and motivation in someone who used to drive everything. Margaret had always been the organizer. In her family and in her professional life, she was the person who noticed what needed to be done and did it without being asked. She scheduled appointments, planned the holidays, coordinated family logistics, tracked what needed to happen next. People around her described her as energetic, proactive, and dependable. Then, gradually, and without a dramatic turning point, she stopped. Not all at once. Quietly. Her husband started picking up tasks she had always handled without realizing he was doing it. Her family noticed she seemed less engaged in discussions about plans. She appeared content to sit and wait where she had always been the one moving things forward. They assumed she was finally relaxing, finally allowing herself to slow down after years of doing everything. In reality, her nervous system was already under immune attack, and one of the consequences of that attack was a measurable reduction in the brain functions that fuel motivated, goal-directed behavior. Motivation, planning, initiative, and goal-directed action are functions of specific brain regions, particularly the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, that are sensitive to the inflammatory environment that active Sjogren's creates. Research in neuroimmunology has established that chronic low-grade neuroinflammation impairs motivational circuitry in ways that produce exactly this kind of behavioral passivity. The person is not lazy. They are not depressed, though depression can coexist. The circuits that generate the internal push to initiate, plan, and execute have been compromised by the ongoing immune assault on neural tissue. What makes this particularly difficult is that the loss of initiative reduces the very behaviors the person would need in order to advocate for their own diagnosis. They become less likely to push for more testing, less likely to seek second opinions, less likely to insist on being taken seriously, not because they do not care, but because the disease has affected the part of the brain that would have pushed them to do exactly that. Recognizing this from the outside, as a family member or friend, may be more important than the person themselves realizing it. If you have noticed this kind of motivation loss in yourself or watched it develop in someone you care about, type the word still in the comments. Sometimes the people who need the most help are the ones who have stopped asking for it. Number 9. Social withdrawal that develops gradually in someone who was never introverted. Claire had chosen a career in public relations because being around people was where she felt most alive. She had a large social network, made plans constantly, and always described being around others as something that gave her energy rather than drained it. She was extroverted in the truest sense and had been for as long as anyone who knew her could remember. Then in her late 50s the world she had built around people began to quietly shrink. She started declining invitations, citing tiredness. She stopped being the one who reached out first. She told herself and her family that she was maturing, that people changed as they aged and maybe she was becoming someone who preferred quiet. She found explanations that made it make sense. 5 years later the Sjogren's diagnosis arrived, and looking back she could trace the social withdrawal almost precisely to the point where her neurological symptoms had begun. The social withdrawal that develops in Sjogren's is not a personality evolution. It is not introversion finally expressing itself. It is the cumulative effect of multiple disease mechanisms making social engagement physically costly in a way it never was before. The fatigue of Sjogren's makes extended conversation exhausting. The cognitive fog makes following multiple threads of discussion in a group difficult and sometimes disorienting. The sensory hypersensitivity that comes with central nervous system involvement makes noisy social environments uncomfortable or even painful. The emotional blunting that results from neuroinflammation reduces the internal reward that socializing used to generate. And the loss of initiative means the person is less likely to arrange the social contact that could have maintained their connections. Each of these mechanisms is documented in research on primary Sjogren's syndrome. Together they produce a withdrawal pattern that looks from the outside like a personality change and feels from the inside like a preference. Neither framing captures what it actually is. It is a neurological and physiological consequence of immune disease. And the person experiencing it did not choose it and is not becoming someone different. They are becoming someone whose nervous system is being outpaced by a disease that has not been identified yet. If this pattern of social withdrawal resonates with you or describes someone you love, type the word retreat in the comments below. Because recognizing it for what it is, not a preference but a symptom, is the first step toward doing something about it. These 9 changes may look like personality evolution, aging, stress, or mood disorder when they are experienced or observed without context. But together they form a pattern with a specific and identifiable origin. Sjogren's syndrome does not stay in the glands. It moves through the entire body. It enters the nervous system. It shapes mood, motivation, cognition, social behavior, sensory experience, and energy in ways that fundamentally change who a person is, long before anyone has thought to look for the disease that is driving those changes. Most people living through this are told they are stressed, depressed, anxious, or simply getting older. They are given labels that do not fit and treatments that do not work, while the real cause continues to go unaddressed. The average time from the first symptoms of Sjogren's to a confirmed diagnosis is between 5 and 7 years. That is not a gap caused by the disease being difficult to detect. It is a gap caused by the early symptoms, particularly the personality and behavioral ones, almost never being connected to the right cause in the first place. And that is exactly what this video is for. If you recognize 2 or more of these 9 changes in yourself or in someone you care about, do not wait. The next step is a specific and targeted evaluation. Ask your doctor about testing for antinuclear antibodies, anti-SSA antibodies, and anti-SSB antibodies. These are the blood markers most closely associated with primary Sjogren's syndrome, and they are not included in a standard blood panel unless you ask for them by name. Bring your symptom history in writing. Bring the full timeline. Bring the pattern. Make it impossible for the appointment to end without the right questions being asked.